Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Verse 13 of chapter 49 of the Holy Quran speaks to the antiquity of the original nation and the aspirational nobility of its members. There are some 5,000 original indigenous nations in the world today of many different cultures and religious outlooks. This is the Original Nation Report. I am your host, Muhammad Al-Hashimi, adjunct professor at Euclid University at euclid.net, and associate scholar at the Center for World Indigenous Studies at cwis.org. In this episode of the Original Nation Report, I will take a look at the African imperialism of Emperor Menelik II as he forcibly incorporated many independent nations and peoples into a geopolitical entity called Ethiopia, beginning in the second half of the 19th century. To highlight this imperial and colonial adventure, I will focus on the suffering of the people of the Oromo nation. As Emperor Menelik II swept into their territories beginning in the 1870s. This episode of the Original Nation Report is titled Abyssinian Imperialism and Colonialism in the Creation of Modern Ethiopia. In May of 1991, a coalition of several indigenous nations known as the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, or EPRDF, came to power in Ethiopia after a 17-year-long struggle against the Marxist government that had ruled the country of Ethiopia over the same period of time. The EPRDF was determined to put an end to the oppressive governance practiced by the Marxist regime that it had in turn inherited from the dictatorial imperial regime of Emperor Haile Selassie. By 1994, the EPRDF had written and promulgated a new constitution that was designed to establish a federal system based on the voluntary union of the different nations and ethnic groups comprising the Ethiopian state, granting each nation, nationality, and people the right to self-determination, including the right to secede, to break away from the Ethiopian state through a procedure clearly spelled out in Article 39 of the new Ethiopian Constitution. This was a deliberate choice. This path was taken to address the historical grievances related to the oppression experienced by indigenous peoples in their forced union into the Ethiopian state, a forced union that began in the second half of the 19th century. These historical grievances emanate from the imperial aggression initiated by King Saleh Mariam, who was born in the Abyssinian province of Shoa, also known as the Kingdom of Mans, in August of 1884, and became king of that province in 1866. After his coronation, King Saleh began to plan and eventually launch a campaign lasting for several years of naked aggression that included the forced assimilation, land expropriation, and cultural suppression of non-Abyssinian nations and peoples, resulting in their colonization to form what is now known as Ethiopia. By 1889, this same King Saleh would become the absolute monarch, not only over all of Abyssinia, but also the conquered non-Abyssinian lands he had acquired by force of arms up to that point in time. A total landmass that geographically became the foundation of Ethiopia as we know it today. That same year of 1889, King Saleh became the ruler over this expansive landmass as Emperor Menelik II, a title and nomenclature by which he is better known to the world today. King Saleh began his imperial move of conquest just before that infamous chapter in world history known as the Scramble for Africa. As a result, his imperial machinations would overlap and become a part of the Scramble for Africa that resulted from the Berlin Conference held in Berlin, Germany in 1884, a meeting convened by the great European powers of the day to determine an orderly invasion, conquest, and colonization of the African continent. These imperial powers included Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Great Britain. The representatives at the conference recognized that King Saleh had already initiated an imperial movement of aggression in Northeast Africa several years prior to their meeting. They decided to leave him to it, especially since King Saleh had been procuring weapons from Europe for several years prior to the Berlin Conference. Thus, the Scramble for Africa had an African counterpart, not usually associated with what most consider an exclusive European enterprise. The African counterpart was none other than the Abyssinian participation in the Scramble for Africa, led by King Saleh, the eventual Emperor Menelik II, in the form of the invasion of several indigenous nations, resulting in an imperial colonization that will form the basis of the current Ethiopian state. The non-Abyssinian nations and peoples of Ethiopia have not forgotten that they were brutally forced into an imperial union that now is recognized as a modern state. As a result, they harbor many grievances that have yet to be ameliorated. The EPRDF recognized this when they came to power, and as a result, formulated and promulgated a constitution designed to offer remedies. Although the EPRDF is no longer in power, their 1994 constitution, the 1994, I should say, progressive constitution remains. Unfortunately, the text of the 1994 constitution languishes as mere words on paper, while the current Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, behaves more and more like Emperor Menelik II, who has openly admitted he deeply admires for his nefarious imperial accomplishments. Thus, historical grievances go largely ignored. The autocratic behavior of the current leader of Ethiopia has led insurgents from the largest indigenous nation in Ethiopia, the Oromo Nation, to become militarily active as a way to force the Ethiopian state to address their historical grievances. This has been done by the fielding of the Oromo Liberation Army, the OLA. Let us take a look at how the people of the Oromo Nation suffered under the imperial and colonial aggression of the Abyssinian armies of Emperor Menelik II. Before the middle of the 19th century, the area of the northern highlands of present-day Ethiopia was known to the outside world as Abyssinia. Due to the largely biblical influences, among others, Abyssinia was also called Ethiopia by some writers. Thus, Abyssinia was also known as the Ethiopian Empire. This geographical area of Abyssinia was composed of four major kingdoms: the kingdoms of Tigray or Aksum, Gondar or Bigamdir, Gajam, and Mans or Shoa. Roughly speaking, the present regional divisions of Tigray, Amhara, and the northern tip of Oromia down to the capital of Addis Ababa are the lands of Abyssinia, the original lands of Abyssinia. The Ethiopian Empire before 1860. For several decades prior to the mid-19th century, the kings of these kingdoms had been locked in an incessant struggle over who would be crowned emperor of the whole of Abyssinia, the emperor being the king of kings. This period, from the mid-18th century to the mid-19th century, was one of devastating strife and struggle over competition for supreme rulership of Abyssinia. This period in the Abyssinian literature is known as Zamani Misafant, translated as the era of judges or the era of princes, as taken from the biblical book of Judges. It lasted from 1869, or I should say 1769, to 1855. During this period, a young prince would be born in the Abyssinian province of Shoa, a young prince who would rise to become an emperor who would expand the borders of the original Abyssinia by force of arms, brutally and mercilessly subjugating millions of indigenous non-Abyssinian peoples in the process, and by so doing, create a new geographical structure that would ultimately become known today as the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. This emperor is none other than Menelik II. As has been noted, Menelik II began his life at Saleh Mariam on the 17th of August 1844 in the Kingdom of Mans, also known as Shoa. By 1866, he had risen to become King Saleh Mariam of Mans. In November of 1889, King Saleh was crowned Emperor Menelik II upon the death of Emperor Johannes IV. Now, what is important here are the activities of King Saleh before his coronation as Emperor Menelik II. Activities that took place between the years 1866 and 1889. It would be this period of 23 years that King Saleh assembled an army of several thousand Shoans, who, like himself, were mostly ethnically Amhara, and launched an expansionist movement of imperial conquest that would see the forced annexation of several non-Abyssinian peoples into what would become the expanded Ethiopian Empire, the area we know today as Ethiopia. In other words, King Saleh, the eventual Emperor Menelik II, was responsible for a period of African imperialism and expansionism, no less egregious, destructive, and oppressive than the European imperialism and expansionism that was going on at roughly the same time in the rest of Africa, the so-called scramble for Africa. Being equipped with modern European weapons gave King Saleh a decided military advantage over any armed force he faced, which was not similarly equipped. The kingdom of Mansa Shoa, being the southernmost of the Abyssinian kingdoms, was strategically located as a region from which invading armies could be launched towards the east, south, and west into non-Abyssinian lands, composed of many independent indigenous nations and nationalities. During this period of imperial expansion, between 1866 and 1889, the lands of Hadia and Olega in the southwest and west respectively, Oromo or Oromia in the south, and Hara in the east, and so many other non-Abyssinian peoples and lands would come under the imperial and colonial control of King Saleh Mariam. The imperial drive by the Amhara military machine, equipped with modern European weapons under King Saleh Mariam, the eventual Emperor Menelik II of Abyssinia, subjugated many non-Amhara, non-Abyssinian peoples in the second half of the 19th century. The largest of these subjugated indigenous peoples were the Oromo. In today's Ethiopia, the Oromo nation remains the most populous indigenous community in the Ethiopian state. It is now estimated that the population has reached a total of 45 million individuals, or 35.8% of a total estimated population for the Ethiopian state of 116 million inhabitants. The invasion of the independent Oromo polities was particularly egregious. One case in point, the invasion of the lands of the Arsi Oromo, a major subgroup of the Oromo nation south of the Abyssinian kingdom of Mans. Beginning in 1879, King Saleh Mariam launched several invasion campaigns against the Arsi Oromo. The Arsi fought back so valiantly, such that for the next 7 years, King Saleh was unable to completely subdue the Arsi, in spite of having superior imported European weaponry. Nevertheless, during this 7-year period, the incursions provided him, that is King Saleh, the eventual Emperor Menelik II, with a huge booty of cattle, slaves, and other goods. According to Dr. Muhammad Hassan, a renowned Oromo historian and academic at Georgia State University in the United States. In a paper published in 2009 titled Islam as an Ideology of Resistance Among the Oromo of Ethiopia, Professor Muhammad Hassan informs us of the following, and I quote, Menelik conquered the Arsi Oromo only after killing thousands of their warriors. His soldiers slaughtered, systematically mutilated, and sold survivors into slavery. Massive mutilation was used to psychologically destroy the people's resistance. The worst mutilations took place in September of 1886 at Azule and Anole. These are places in the Oromo region. At Azule, there were massacred 12,000 RC Oromo, while in Anole, thousands of mutilated hands and breasts, that is, breasts from women, were tied around the necks of the victims who were sent back to their villages. Other mutilated hands were hung on a tree, under which the Shoan soldiers from shore sang and danced in celebration of their exploit. Muhammad Ademo, that was the end of quote from Dr. Muhammad Hassan. But I've got another important quote coming up from Muhammad Ademo, an Oromo journalist and historian and editor-in-chief of oldpride.com. He sheds additional light on this horrific chapter in RC Oromo history in a published 2014 article titled Anole, a tragedy on which Ethiopian sources are silent, from which I now quote directly. In the late 19th century, at the same time as the scramble for Africa, Emperor Menelik II set out to forcibly incorporate independent Oromo territories into his nascent empire. Menelik faced a fierce resistance from the Arsi. When Menelik's army of conquest, equipped with modern firearms acquired from Western powers, arrived in the early 1880s, the Arsi were in for a rude surprise. However, the Arsi waged a valiant war of resistance. The Arsi repeatedly ambushed and kept Menelik's forces at bay for 6 years between 1880 and 1886, winning all 38 running battles. But on September the 6th of 1886, the ferocious Arsi fighters finally succumbed to Menelik's state-of-the-art weapons, with their spears and shields outmatched. An armistice was declared after an estimated 12,000 Oromo fighters perished in a single day's battle. But the suspension of open hostility did not end Menelik's appetite to crush and humiliate the Arsi. In 1887, Menelik's forces came back to terrorize the remaining population into total submission. A meeting to, quote, make peace, unquote, with the Arsi and, quote, deliberate, unquote, and on the future administrative matters was called. Thousands gathered at Anole. Menelik himself then arrived to deliver the ultimatum that they, the RC Oromo, would be annihilated if they didn't accept his rule. The RC insisted on maintaining their indigenous Gada system of socio-political organization, while accepting, although begrudgingly, Menelik as king. Then Menelik's army ordered those RC in attendance to enter a narrow pass, one by one. The right hands of all males that entered were cut completely off. The Shoan Amharas tied the hand they cut to the neck of the victim. In the same manner, the right breasts of the women were also cut and tied to their neck. As a further form of humiliation, fear, and terror, The mutilated breasts and hands were tied around the necks of the victims, who were then sent back home. End the quote from the journalist Muhammad Ademo. To commemorate this horrific event that remains permanently etched in the collective memory of the R.C. Oromo, the Anole Cultural Center was erected in the R.C. town of Hetosa. On the 6th of April 2014, hundreds of thousands of Oromo gathered at Hetosa for the unveiling of the center. Muhammad Ademo states the following about the Cultural Center, and I quote, "The Cultural Center houses the Oromo Martyrs Memorial Monument, an ethnographic museum and mural. Standing several inches on top of a tomb, the monument shows a severed hand stretched upward, holding a woman's breast, also severed. It is erected as a tribute to the R.C. Oromo, whose hands and breasts were mutilated by the 19th century Ethiopian Emperor Menelik II. By 1887, the R.C. Oromo were brought under the complete control of the Shoan Amhara forces of King Sahle Mariam, just 2 years before his coronation as Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia. Another sad story is the invasion of Harar. Harar is located in the far eastern highlands of Ethiopia. Harar is an ancient Muslim city with founding roots that appear to go back as early as the 7th century of the Christian era. At some point in 1886, Sahle Mariam, the king of Mans, was preparing to invade the independent emirate of Harar under its last independent leader, Amir Haji Abdullahi ibn Ali Abdul Shakur. King Sahle marched his army to a place known as Chalanko on the 6th of January 1887 and encountered the forces of the Emir. Due to King Sahle's superiority in armaments, the Shoan army easily defeated the Emir's forces. King Sahle Mariam, the future Emperor Menelik II, entered the walled city of Harar and found what he thought was the main Jami or congregational mosque of the city, entered the mosque and proceeded to urinate in it in order to show his utter disdain for the religion of Islam. Subsequently, King Sahle had the mosque torn down and had an Ethiopian Orthodox Christian church built on the same spot. This church still stands today inside the wall of Harar as a reminder to the Muslims of Emperor Menelik II's abominable insult to the Muslims of Harar, Ethiopia, and indeed the Muslims of the whole world. Thus, Harar became a part of Menelik's imperialist expansion and colonial subjugation project. The defeat of Harar opened the door to the conquest of the surrounding Oromo region of Harage. Professor Muhammad Hassan, the renowned Oromo academic and scholar referred to earlier, offers additional insight into the conquest of Harar and the surrounding region of Harage on the eastern part of the Ethiopian state. And I quote again from Dr. Muhammad Hassan. Menelik invaded Harar and defeated the Muslim force on the 7th of January, 1887. With a single victory, he gained a rich and vast surrounding region of Harage that brought him closer to the sea, that is the Red Sea, from where he imported weapons from Europe. The heavy yoke of supporting Menelik's large army fell on the conquered Oromo peasantry of Harage. His unpaid soldiery, known in the Amhara language as Neftanyas, that is gun bearers, raided the conquered people for cattle and slaves on the slightest pretext. Atrocities occurred as troops slayed adult men and women and dispatched their children into slavery. End of quote. Professor Muhammad goes on to explain how the once freedom-loving and proud Oromo of Harage were reduced to virtual serfdom. And I quote now. After the conquest and occupation, Menelik distributed 2/3 of the conquered land among the armed Shoan Amharas, the settlers, the Abyssinian Orthodox Church, and the Abyssinian Crown, while he allowed 1/3 for the indigenous Oromo people on the condition that they supply forced labor to the settlers and various taxes, dues, and tithes for his court and the church. In their own land, the Oromo and their conquered people became landless serfs. With the conquest of Harar and Harage, the imperialist expansion of King Saleh was growing ever larger. Thus, these forced annexations would greatly expand the size of the original Abyssinia. By 1889, King Saleh Mariam was crowned Emperor Menelik II upon the death of Emperor Johannes IV. After 1889, Emperor Menelik's project of imperial expansion continued further east, south, and west, creating an imperial realm more than 3 times the size of the original landmass of Abyssinia. Geographically, for the most part, the imperial realm became the Ethiopia we know today. By 1904, Emperor Menelik's imperial and colonial expansion had been largely completed. The Ethiopian Empire would reach its greatest extent when Emperor Haile Selassie, the successor to Emperor Menelik II, took control of Eritrea with the help of the United Nations in September of 1952. However, by September of 1961, the Eritreans launched organized armed rebellion against the Ethiopian crown. The rebellion would last nearly 30 years until May of 1991, when Eritrea declared independence from Ethiopia. Thus, the Ethiopian state today is the result of a brutal African imperial expansion, forcibly incorporating previously independent indigenous nations and peoples. It is very important to understand that ethnic tensions in Ethiopia today, particularly those tensions directed at the state, have their origin in the imperial expansion of Emperor Menelik II. Inter-ethnic tensions are exacerbated by ethnic Amharas, who see Emperor Menelik as a national hero, in contradistinction to those mostly non-Amhara ethnic groups such as the Oromo, who see Emperor Menelik as a personification of evil and oppression. Haile Selassie does not escape the ire of non-Amhara ethnic groups, as he did much through formal policy to entrench pro-Amhara, pro-Abyssinian cultural assimilation that non-Amhara, non-Abyssinian nations and peoples found so abhorrent. It is also important to understand that the current geopolitical entity we see on the map as the country of Ethiopia is no more than 150 years old. The 3,000-year-old, never before colonized narrative about Ethiopian society and culture you often hear or read about refers only to the Abyssinian core of the current Ethiopian state. However, no doubt, the non-Abyssinian nations and peoples of Ethiopia have their own narratives of antiquity as nations and peoples going back several millennia. And while it might be argued that Ethiopia has never been colonized by a European power during the scramble for Africa, Ethiopia is nevertheless the result of African imperialism and colonialism, no less brutal and oppressive than its European counterpart. Well, this is it for me today for this second episode of the Original Nation Report, which has been titled Abyssinian Imperial Expansion in the Creation of Modern Ethiopia. I have been your host and presenter, Muhammad Al-Hashimi. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace, mercy, and blessings of Allah be upon you.